Hey folks, it's Mr. Van Scoy again. In our continued lessons here on ecology, we're going to take a look at the cycles of matter and energy transfer in ecosystems. When you're done with this lesson today, you should be able to describe how energy is transferred throughout a food web. Start off with a quote here from Rachel Carson, kind of famous naturalist author who wrote Silent Spring. She published that book in 1962, kind of talking about the very negative side effects on the environment, especially on birds, in the use of pesticides. Her quote, "In nature, nothing exists alone," which fits in perfectly talking about ecosystems and ecology. Food chains and food webs are really just diagrams that represent feeding relationships. And remember that these are models. So as we go through some of these, the models aren't going to be perfect, but they're there to represent ideas of real things that happen in nature. Basically, this model shows how energy and matter move through ecosystems. And really talking about the relationships of who eats who, or who eats whom. Food chains represent a single pathway by which energy and matter flow through an ecosystem. In this example here, you can see that food chains are generally simpler than what really happens in nature. And you can see that energy flow. The energy flows from the plant to the grasshopper. That grasshopper is eaten by a bird, flows to the bird then. Those birds are sometimes eaten by snakes, which then that energy of the bird flows to the snake. And then snakes can be eaten by owls, so then the energy flows to the owl. I've included a spot here so that you might come up with some example food chains of your own. Try to create a food chain of something that we might find here in our own mitten state. If you need help with that, make sure you ask your neighbors for help, and if they can't help you out with that, I'll be happy to go over some examples. All right, intersecting food chains. Food web represents multiple pathways through which energy and matter flow through an ecosystem. It includes many intersecting food chains. It demonstrates that most organisms eat and are eaten by more than one species. And here I've actually got a Lake Michigan food web showing all the different critters, again, right here in our own state. Kind of starting off down here with our producers, our different types of algae and microorganisms, small little animals that are eaten by critters up above, and then again going up here to the different types of fish. So, and even within fish, we have different levels of consumers, and then you're going to have your top predators. All right, and again, we've got another diagram here showing a food web. This one more land-based, although it does have some aquatic elements. So again, I've put some space here for you to, actually it says food chain, that should be a food web. Just kind of change that typo on the fly there. So ask you guys to make a very simple food web outline here. You don't have to necessarily include pictures, just want you to think about food webs that we might have here in our own state or even our own county. Ecosystems require constant inputs of energy, and that almost always comes from sunlight, occasionally from chemicals. The producers use the energy in inorganic molecules to make the food, so are things like plants. Consumers take in the food by eating producers or other living things. We have our decomposers, which are going to break down dead organisms and other organic waste, and then they're going to release inorganic molecules back to the environment. And got some pictures here of some turkeys right from my backyard, and they're eating little grubs and things out of the ground and other types of seeds and whatnot. So they're consuming these producers. And everyone's favorite decomposer, little earthworm, again from right outside my door. All right, keep in mind, I was talking about the energy inputs. Photosynthesis and cellular respiration, which also includes anaerobic processes, are going to provide most of the energy for life processes. On the previous slide, I had listed chemotrophs, and I've also mentioned chemotrophs in some previous lessons. Just quick review, chemotrophs are going to be organisms that do not rely on sunlight to get their energy. They're going to make food completely from chemicals without directly or even indirectly relying on the sun. But almost all of them are going to use the sun for their energy source. Plants or algae form the lowest levels of the food web. And some algae here from Lake Erie, not Huron. At each link upward in a food web, only a small fraction of the matter that's eaten at the lower level is actually transferred upward, and then that energy is going to be used for growth and releasing energy in cellular respiration at the higher level. So given this inefficiency, there are usually fewer organisms at the top of a food web than there are at the bottom. And again, as the energy is produced down here by our plants and then consumed by herbivores, and then we have our different predators, every link or level through that food web, it becomes less and less efficient. So less energy, a little bit less energy, actually a lot of energy is lost. So it becomes very inefficient. Almost none of that energy is actually transferred up, which is why our herbivores and predators have to eat so much to get that energy. All right, food webs can also be looked at by trophic levels, and these trophic levels are the different feeding levels. So we have our producers, they're going to make their own food. We also have followed then by our primary consumers. They're going to consume the producers, so they're going to be the ones that are actually eating or taking in the ones that are making the food. And then we can talk about a secondary consumer and tertiary consumer. And again, just to, I see I've actually got a couple different slides here, but on this, energy and biomass decrease from lower levels to the higher levels. So at the most, only 10% is passed on. The part that I had mentioned is very inefficient, that's lost. 90% of that is going to go towards the metabolism of the organism and the heat, or lost heat. Keep in mind that some matter reacts to release energy for life functions. Some matter is stored in newly made structures. And again, that a lot of it is discarded or lost to the environment. I keep talking about things being inefficient and lost, but something else to keep in mind, well, actually I have that on the next slide. We're going to talk about conservation. So backing up a little bit, the chemical elements that make up the molecules of organisms pass through food webs and into and out of the atmosphere and the soil, and they are combined and recombined in different ways. So those same elements, the things that's making up the food or that organisms, they're still there, they're just getting broken down and reassembled, which is what one of our final slides here is talking about, is that at each link in an ecosystem, matter and energy are conserved. Okay. Again, remember that the energy transfer is not very efficient, but the matter and energy that was there, it doesn't just disappear. It gets lost to the environment, or it gets changed into something that can't be used for energy, so it is still there. Law of conservation. It's just not in a usable form. All right, and wrapping up here, photosynthesis and cellular respiration are very important components of the carbon cycle. In the carbon cycle, we have carbon that's being moved around and exchanged between the biosphere, that's all the living things on the planet, the atmosphere, the oceans, and the geosphere through chemical processes, physical, geologic, and biological processes. So carbon is moved around and exchanged between all of those different areas in our planet, and it goes through all of these different types of processes. Okay, went through a lot in this lesson here, talking about how energy is transferred through the food web. If you have any questions about that, like with any of our topics, please don't hesitate to ask. Hopefully this helped.